Time now for us to gaze into the future, and who better to help us gaze into the future than a futurologist? A professional futurist is another way of describing this profession. I'm going to introduce in a second a woman who spends all her time analyzing not the millennials that we all talk about, but the generation after the millennials, Generation Z as it's sometimes called. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with me the founder of a website called After the Millennials, Anne Boysen.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for having me. It's truly an honor to be here. Now, it looks like I work at the Marriott, but I don't. I just haven't got my luggage yet. So I'm wearing a uniform. I'll try. They were very graciously to let me borrow their clothes, so I'm going to try not to put a shame on their corporate brand. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the next generation, or they're already here. So, do I have a clicker, by the way? Forgot. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry. Okay. So let's see. Yep. There we go. Okay, so this is roughly speaking the different generations that we have around us today. Of course, we have a group that is younger than Generation Z, and of course, we have a group that is older than Boomers. But I'd like to first get a little bit of an idea. Are there anybody here in this audience who are born after 1996? Wow. Anyone more? So we have one person, or two, one. Oh, wow. Amazing. We're already, wow. You know, a few years ago, like 5 years ago, it's like, no, we were only talking about the next generation. So when I talk about the next generation, I'm already dating myself. Now, anybody here whose younger sisters or brothers are born after 1996? Okay. I'm starting to see some hands. Yes, good. Now, what about who have children in that generation? Okay, yeah, I figured there would be probably the majority. And what about grandchildren? Anybody? Grandchildren, yes. Great-grandchildren? All right, so as a futurist or futurologist, I spend a lot of time thinking about change. I don't predict the future. I'm sorry if you came here. I'm not going to be able to predict anything. That's really, I don't have a crystal ball. My job is to try to understand change. And there's many different ways of trying to approach that topic of change. One way is to look at change as different levels of an iceberg. So it depends on like where you focus on the iceberg tells you a little bit about what sort of change we're talking about. So we can choose to focus at the tip of the iceberg and we look at the events. This is the news headlines. You know, this is like a hurricane slams into coastal region causing massive damage, or another school shooting in an American high school, or Iceland legalizes equal pay between men and women, or American president says something crazy on Twitter. Anyway, or we can go one level down and we can look at trends. This is the area where events become, where we kind of look at the frequency of different events, how different events seem to cluster or congregate. Then we can talk about trends. So we can focus on, for example, how many hurricanes. It might be an increase of hurricanes that are slamming into the coastal regions. There might have been an increase in school shootings. Or increase, what does that say about access to weapons? What does it say about mental illness? Or there might have been an increase in women in powerful positions that are demanding change. So this is the trend level. This is sort of like where we go ask more questions. We're able to see how things are moving. But if we really want to understand change and really have some kind of inkling about how to forecast the future, we need to go down to that very deepest level. And that's where we have the driving forces. You can think of the driving forces as the deep structural undercurrents that you don't necessarily see. Think of it as the rock that you throw into a pond. The rock is gone. You don't see it anymore, but you see the ripple effects. So the ripple effects are the trends. They're measurable. They are verified by research, and you can sort of measure it. You can't do that with driving forces as easily. But having been in this field of research for about 15 years and studied this generation since they were very young, they seem to be, the trends that are characterizing this generation seem to be the cross impact of two particular driving forces. And these green bubbles here, these are some of those trends that are showing up in research. Like if you look at Generation Z today and you compare with a youth cohort from maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you'll see that there is a change. And what it seems to be is a cross product of these two driving forces called the post-recession economy and digital transformation. Now, the post-recession economy, if we think of the oldest member of this generation being born around 1996, they were just entering their teenage years when the last recession happened, the worst recession since the 30s. So they became aware, like developmentally, when you enter your teenage years, that's when you realize sort of your place in the society, etc. So they came of age. They had their formative years seeing their parents and friends' parents losing their jobs, maybe having to foreclose on their homes. They saw the older sisters and brothers not being able to get jobs with their high educations, or being in undereducated positions for a long time. They saw their grandparents not being able to take out retirement because they lost all of their pension in the stock market crash. This was their their formative experience at a very young age. There's another component to the post-recession economy. This was the time when we really started seeing that the recovery from the recession was less dependent on labor input, meaning that we saw decoupling of productivity from labor. What that really means is that businesses became less dependent on hiring full-time workers. They could use contract workers, they could automate a lot of their services, which means that the younger generation today is growing up in what we call the precariat, or a precarious economy, where we're still awaiting those new business models and industrial models that makes everything click. The second driving force is digital transformation. And digital transformation is a little bit different than merely saying that they're so tech savvy, because there's a lot of surveys that are indicating they're not necessarily a whole lot better in a very narrow definition of technology. If you could operate a computer before graphic user interfaces, you might actually have more narrow technical skills because you have to use things like command language and things like that. What this really means, being a digital native really means that your whole experience is defined by that interconnection between the physical and the digital reality. The digital filter helps determine how you form friendships, how you discover new hobbies, how you learn new skills, how you perceive the world, how you perceive that you have some impact on the world, how you define yourself, how you define your self-image or self-images, your self-identities, plural. There's also a quantitative component to this digital transformation. One of the most common questions that I get from my audiences and from the business leaders that I work with is, why does this young generation have such a short attention span? Now, if you look at the graph, you'll see that there's quite a bit of more information that needs to be processed in the same amount of time. We still have 24 hours in a day, 60 seconds in a minute, and they're trying to squeeze it all in. In 1 minute, 300 hours of content is being uploaded to YouTube every minute. Netflix, the CEO of Netflix, is saying that their main competitor is sleep, people's sleep. And this is not even counting, this is counting only the information that they have to process, which they don't really have to interact with. Then you add the group chats that they're in, the Snapchat stories, somebody changed a profile picture, somebody mentioned you in a tweet, and you have to retweet, and you have to post, you have to Instagram, you have to share, tag, post. Whew. There once the time. There it goes after that. There goes Generation Z's time. There's been a lot of studies lately on what type of impact we can expect from this constant interaction with technology, this constant interaction with information. So one of the researchers in this field, her name is Jean Twenge. She's a professor at the University of California. And she had an article that went viral a while ago, about a year ago, where she asked if smartphones have destroyed a generation. She pointed to some very interesting paradoxes. The paradox is this generation is more connected than any generation before, yet they're more lonely. They are less likely to be arrested, less likely to become pregnant in teenage years, they're less likely to use drugs and alcohol. In many ways, they stay on the straight and narrow, and nonetheless, they're more anxious, they're more depressed, and the suicide rate has climbed up as well. So it's quite troubling what's going on. And further research, after Twenge's research, have indeed verified or confirmed that there is a link here. There is definitely a link between smartphone usage or social media usage and also their sense of being miserable. However, it might be a little bit too premature to blame it only on the technology itself, because what we're finding out is that the digital filter tends to augment what they already feel. So if you already in the physical world, if you're dealing with bullying, if you're dealing with a negative experiences, they tend to unfortunately be accentuated. Or if you use social media to reflect yourself, if the social media becomes the mirror that reflects self, people are doomed to fail, because the algorithms of social media are created in such a way that it's always the most popular. It's always the people who have more than you, have more followers, who have more likes, the people who seem to be climbing up the social hierarchy faster than you, that get placed in your newsfeed. Now, younger generations, what's interesting is that they're moving away from these open, large platforms where that type of comparison is very common, and they're moving more into these closed platforms, such as Snapchat, where you can have self-destructing messages, and there's more a communication that is one-to-one. The other thing we're starting to see with this younger generation is that they are indeed more aware of this dynamic. Growing up with having to cultivate an image since you're very young means that you also know how to curate your self-image. And again, we're talking about self-images or self-identities. So you might have a Finstagram where you present yourself the way you want your future boss to see you. And then you have the Rinstagram, which is the Finstagram is the fake Instagram. Then you have the Rinstagram, which is the real Instagram, where you can interact with your friends and your family, and you can be goofy. So they're already maturing a sense of understanding of what's happening here. But we still have to ask the question, why are our kids so worried? What is troubling them? And it turns out there's so many things. We can look beyond screens to find out things that they worry about. 87% worry about something so basic as the world running out of natural resources. 85% worry that the world is going to not have enough fresh water, right? 79% worry about finding a job. 40% worry that the career path that they're staking out might be taken over by artificial intelligence or robotics. These are real worries. One study done by Norina Hers in England, she interviewed 2,000, I think it was around 2,000 young people and had conversations with them. She found that only 1 out of 10 trust their government. What does that say? It means that 90% believe in system failure. They believe that the track we're on is no longer going to work. And I don't want this to turn into a gloomy presentation. I promise you it won't. And I've spent a lot of time trying to ask young people, what gives you hope? What is that one thing that gives you hope? Unfortunately, it's not one thing. There's not a silver bullet, a magical solution coming out of Silicon Valley, tiny gadgets or anything like that. They're far too skeptical. They're far too realistic to believe that. But what do young people do when their phones don't work anymore? When a system is failing, what do? They reset the system. And that is precisely what I think that we are going to see. And resetting the system is far more than coming up with a single new gadget. So much more than that. As a matter of fact, this is the generation that is going to transition us from an old, obsolete, unsustainable system that is not working anymore and take us into the fourth industrial revolution. Anybody familiar here? Everybody familiar with the fourth industrial revolution? It is a term that has been coined by the World Economic Forum to describe the new era that we're going into, where we have dramatic new technologies that really do have some opportunities of solving a lot of the issues that we will be dealing with in the future, and at the same time create new social challenges. And that's the thing. This young generation, they're far beyond thinking of technology itself of being the source of disruption. What they're doing, they're actually disrupting the idea space. They're not saying that, the technology is not the solution. Technology is part of the solution. But more than millennials, they seem to be questioning more deeper, more structural questions than simply technology itself. And it actually turns out that younger generation tend to respond that technology is a tool, while it's really the social questions, the more deeper issues that need to be asked. They feel a need to completely dissect every norm, every convention, every idea, to completely disrupting the idea space. And they start here. They start with something so basic as the question about gender, something we have considered a biological binary for centuries. And they're questioning, is that true? So what we're starting to say is that younger generations today are far more likely to either themselves identify as in that hetero versus homo dichotomy, and also they're far less likely to consider gender as a binary. As a matter of 56% of Generation Zers in one study mentioned that they know someone who go by non-gendered pronoun. What that means is that more than half of Generation Zers know somebody who don't consider themselves either male nor female, but somewhere in between. 48% see themselves not 100% heterosexual. What that means is that they no longer see homosexuality and heterosexuality as two dichotomous, two mutually exclusive categories. And we're seeing this with a lot of issues with nationality, with ethnicity. They no longer want to deal with the predefined categories. They're completely dismantling a lot of these categories. And what that allows us to ask is, what does that mean for their perception of equality? For one thing, we know equality is one of those values that they hold very close. Well, if you can no longer deal with two opposite categories, two mutually exclusive categories that have operated in this social hierarchy, with one category had power over another, what does that do? Might that completely dissolve the power structure? Because we know that we have a fluid scale, we no longer have a dichotomous scale. In order to discriminate, we need to have something to discriminate. They're also all about authenticity. When we no longer have the social hierarchies of the past defining what you should strive for, you have more freedom to be yourself. And this is what young people are actually answering in service as well, that they would much rather like to stand out than blend in. This woman here, the prom in the U.S., that is a big celebration at the high school. In the high schools in the U.S., and she had been bullied for several years, Kayama McIntyre. And instead of pacifying her bullies by blending in, she instead designed her own gown, her prom gown, gown to stand out and celebrate her African American heritage. And I just love her quote here: "Never leave your identity in the hands of society," because this is exactly what this generation is all about. We're also starting to see that this new sense of being authentic, of being yourself, we're starting to see it in their shopping habits as well. They're much more likely to go to thrift stores, for example, and buy online resale products instead of buying new. Shopping malls in the US, and I believe we're starting to see that a little bit in Europe too, are starting to be abandoned in order for young people to buy secondhand. Where they're more likely to save. We have 13-year-olds that are starting to save for retirement. I didn't think about that when I was 13. We're also starting to see that they are defining the social signifiers are no longer so much tied to brands as they see themselves as their own brand. They don't need to piggyback on an existing brand to emit some sort of status, to emit some sort of social status. What's interesting about this as well, this newfound frugality, is that it is actually triggering a sense of entrepreneurialism, a new type of entrepreneurialism. This is why the reason this whole new non-traditional way of trading, the reason this is interesting is because it allows you to be not only a producer or a consumer, but it allows you to blend. Again, two categories that have used to be seen as mutually exclusive. It allows young people to become prosumers and act with one another in the peer-to-peer economy. Uber comes to mind, Airbnb comes to mind. Again, doing away with old business models. Looking at that third space, looking at these other areas where they can make a living, where they can have an effect on society. And their entrepreneurialism is manifesting itself more as a sort of having a social objective, having this social impact. Again, it's far more than, you will not impress your peers anymore by just merely having a gadget, being able to say that I was able to create this app, this new Angry Bird game. That is not going to, that's not what has social cachet for this generation. Again, they're all about trying to solve existing problems, physical problems in the real world. So I wanted to put up Mihira Garimella here, who I think is a very good example. He created disaster drones. He designed some disaster drones that were based on the response reflexes of fruit flies. Because what he realized was that in disaster areas, you have a very unpredictable environment, but most disaster drones follow very predictable routes. So they're not very well synced to be in that type of environment. And he was able to create that already at the age of 16. And again, he wants to do that to have a real, tangible outcome with his technology. But it doesn't have to be high tech. So this is another one. This is Naomi Benson. This is a product that she created, which is called Wish to Wish, an app where she allowed young people to put their wishes and interact with their peers based on the expressed wishes that they had and communicating with others. What she realized that there's not enough consensus and understanding in the world. So she foresaw, well, what can I do to kind of create a conversation that seems to be missing? Because as a matter of fact, young people today don't really feel that older people are setting a good example of consensus and understanding. And this is from before the G7 meeting, by the way, that I meant this. So I think actually it was Albert Einstein that predicted this generation the best. We can't solve problems by using the same type of thinking that we used when we created them. And that is exactly the type of mindset that I sense when I talk to these young people after studying them for 15 years. Is so much more than finding a technical solution. It's about shifting the whole mindset, because that is what's going to make them our next superheroes. And we have to allow them to be our superheroes. We might, in fact, have to give them the tools, the opportunities, and perhaps even get out of their space. Thank you so much.
I Actually, I wanted to shake your hand and say thank you, and that was truly fascinating. One thing I've noticed actually is that the generation you're talking about are no longer. When I was a young man, just passed my driving test, I was desperate to get myself a car. I think I bought a Fiat 500 for £100 in Western London, which didn't have a reverse gear. It was rather difficult to drive. But the generation of my son, who's 18, and my other son is 23, they're like, it's not their prime ambition now that they've both got their driving license, but they don't need to go out and get a car. Is there a difference there as well?
Yes, it's true. Actually, in some surveys, you see that when young people do get their driver's license, it's because they need identification. So it's, and I think it's a double trend here. For one thing, this not needing to own things. It's more about experiences.
The sharing economy.
The sharing economy, exactly. To be part of that sharing economy where you don't need to own things. And that, again, is part of that. Well, for one thing, they won't be able to. A lot of them simply will not have the money to buy a car. Then, it's also this anticipation, I believe, that in the future we might have self-driving cars. And so they might not even need to own a car because you could just have an app and you have the car pick you up when you need it. So, but that's very true. That's one of those trends that we see very clearly with this generation.
And truly fascinating talk. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.